What would you do if a single sentence spoken by a trembling old cowboy stopped an entire room? Cold out in the dusty edge of the American West, a group of native men walked into a roadside bar expecting silent suspicion, maybe even fear. But instead, an old rancher stood up, looked their leader straight in the eye, and said words no one in that room could explain. "Hello, sir. My son has a mark just like yours. A mark no outsider was supposed to have. A mark tied to a promise, a rescue, and a debt buried deep in the past. Stay with me, because once you hear what happened next, you'll never look at fate, loyalty, or family the same way again." Let's begin the story. The sun was sinking low behind the ridge when the old roadside bar filled with the familiar glow of late afternoon. Golden light filtered through the dusty window panes, catching the floating specks hanging in the air like tiny suspended stars. A couple of truckers nursed their beers at the counter. Two young cowboys joked loudly about a horse race coming up on Saturday, and the bartender wiped the same patch of counter with slow, lazy circles. From a corner booth, an old man plucked absent-mindedly at an out-of-tune guitar, letting a few wandering chords drift into the room. It was the kind of hour when nothing unexpected ever happened, when the world felt small, predictable, and tucked into the familiar rhythm of the American West. People talked about hay prices, broken fence posts, the weather rolling in from the foothills. The bar was comfortable the way a worn boot is comfortable. It fit the shape of the people inside it. And then, the door opened. The wooden door slammed inward with a gust of wind, sharp enough to scatter dust across the floorboards. 6 men stepped through the doorway in a straight line, quiet, steady, and unmistakably native. Their presence didn't explode into the room. It settled there heavy and deliberate, like the weight of a storm that hadn't yet broken. They weren't loud. They weren't aggressive. They didn't swagger the way some rough men did. But their silence carried authority, an old ancestral authority that didn't need volume to be felt. Their clothing mixed traditional details with rugged, modern wear, bead-worked leather jackets, long braids tied behind their shoulders, and silver Navajo bracelets that clinked softly when they moved. Their boots hit the floor with slow, unhurried thuds. Every man in the room tensed. The guitar fell silent first. Then the bartender's hand froze mid-polish. The 2 young cowboys stopped laughing the way a campfire hisses out in the rain. Conversations died mid-sentence. No one looked directly at the native men, but no one looked away either. Everyone found some convenient corner of the room to stare at. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was that quiet, wary respect small towns carried toward people they didn't fully understand. Stories had been told. Warnings had been whispered. And in places like this, stories took root deeper than fact. The 6 men walked several steps into the bar. The temperature of the room seemed to drop not colder, but tighter, denser, like the air was holding its breath. And then, from the dimmest corner of the bar, a chair creaked. An old cowboy rose slowly from the shadows. Elias Brent. He had been sitting alone, half hidden by the angle of the ceiling fan's spinning blades. His coat was old, the leather cracked around the edges, but polished from years of wear. His boots were scuffed, but cared for. His shoulders stooped slightly with age, but his gaze was level and unwavering. There was nothing threatening about him, just a quiet determination in the lines of his face. When he stepped out of the shadows, he didn't tremble. He didn't avert his eyes. He simply squared his jaw, took one breath that shuddered in his chest, and said the words that froze the entire bar. "Hello, sir," he said, voice steady, though his hands weren't. "My son has a mark just like yours." The room went dead still. The truckers turned in their seats. The young cowboy stopped blinking. The bartender's rag dropped from her fingers and hit the floor without a sound. Every pair of eyes snapped to the old cowboy and then to the native men. Talon Yazzie, the man at the center of the group, stopped mid-stride. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He didn't move. He only turned his head slowly toward Elias' dark eyes, narrowing just enough to show interest, but not aggression. Talon was a broad-shouldered man, with the kind of stillness that made even silence feel deliberate. His presence was a force in itself, but not a violent one. It was the stillness of a calm river that could turn deadly if pushed. He studied Elias like a man might study a gust of wind, quietly measuring whether it came with warning. Without a word, Talon lifted his arm and pulled back his sleeve. A symbol revealed itself on his skin, curved lines made of blackened ash and red ochre forming the spiral of rushing water, crossed by the stylized wings of a hawk. The marks weren't crude, they weren't decorative. They carried the deliberate detail of a rite older than memory. It was a spirit mark, not one anyone could simply choose to wear. Talon let the sleeve fall but didn't lower his gaze. When he spoke, his voice was low, sharp in a way that cut through the thickened air more cleanly than the old cowboy's words had. "Where did your son get that mark?" The question wasn't angry. It wasn't suspicious. It was searching. Elias swallowed hard. His throat felt like it had turned to sand. He was born with it, Elias said quietly. But it changed, shifted after the night he saved a native boy by the river. 10 years ago. A whisper moved through the group behind Talon. Almost nothing, just the soft rustle of fabric, as a couple of them exchanged glances. The kind of glances that meant something heavy had just been laid at their feet. Someone in the bar murmured, "Saved a boy," and then quickly shut his mouth. Talon didn't break eye contact with Elias. 10 years, he repeated. "Yes," Elias said. 10 years this spring." The old cowboy's voice trembled not from fear, but from something deeper. He hesitated, then stepped closer, close enough that the light caught the fearful sheen in his eyes. "My son disappeared last night," he said. "They threatened him. They threatened us both. A group of men trying to take our ranch. He refused to sell. I found blood on the fence this morning. And tire tracks. He stopped, breath hitching. "I need help," Elias whispered. "I'm afraid they took him." A murmur rippled through the bar again, this time not out of fear of the native men, but fear of what Elias had just said. The world held its breath. Talon didn't. He took one step forward. One of the warriors behind him gave a slight nod, the kind of nod that carried meaning. Recognition, memory, permission. Talon's voice softened, but only slightly, like a river smoothing its surface but strengthening beneath. "If he carries this mark," Talon said then, "he is under our protection." A couple of patrons sucked in sharp breaths. A spirit mark was not a tattoo. It was not a decoration. It was a bond, one that came from an act of courage, sacrifice, or spiritual intervention. For a cowboy to have one at all, it defied every boundary between their worlds. Talon lifted his hand palm open, and one of the warriors behind him made a swift hand signal. Instantly, the group turned in unison toward the door. They didn't ask Elias for proof. They didn't ask for more explanation. The decision had already been made. Elias stared at them, stunned. Then something inside him, fear, hope, desperation, propelled him forward. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he followed the 6 native warriors out of the bar. No one else in the room moved. Not a breath, not a whisper. People stared at the closing door, stunned into absolute silence. What do you think that mark really stands for? And where do you believe it truly came from? Share your thoughts with us. Don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most powerful part of the story. The moment the bar door closed behind them, the world outside felt colder than it had just minutes before. The sun had already dipped completely below the ridge, leaving the plains bathed in a dim blue half-light. A thin veil of wind swept across the dirt road, carrying with it the smell of dust and sagebrush, and something else Elias couldn't quite name. Talon Yazi stopped walking. He lifted his head slightly, as if listening to a distant voice carried on the wind. His long braids shifted against his jacket. For a heartbeat, he didn't move at all. Elias slowed, hesitating behind him. The native warriors exchanged brief glances, but none spoke. Finally, Talon turned toward Elias, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "Tell me," he said quietly. "The boy by the river. What exactly happened?" Elias drew in a long, steadying breath. "That was 10 years ago," he said. "All I know is what my son told me." Talon studied him, gaze narrowing, not with suspicion, but with the precision of a man trying to measure truth down to its bones. The old cowboy cleared his throat, lowered his eyes for a moment, and then began. And as he spoke, the night around them seemed to shift, softening, bending, as though memory itself opened a doorway they were all about to walk through. Elias's voice grew distant, almost hollow, as though carried from another time. "There was a storm that day," he said. "One of the bad ones." And the memory unfolded like a curtain lifting. The sky above Red Springs had turned the color of bruised steel. Clouds hung heavy and swollen, dragging low over the hills. Lightning cracked across the horizon, illuminating the jagged outlines of the ridges. The wind hit first sharp, cold, insistent, then came the downpour. Rain slammed into the earth so hard it bounced back into the air. The narrow dirt path that followed the edge of the valley turned into a rushing vein of muddy water within minutes. 17-year-old Calder Brandt rode straight through the storm. His coat flapped violently behind him, soaked through in seconds. His brown horse fought against the torrents of water flooding the trail, hooves splashing hard with every step. Calder's hair stuck to his forehead, rainwater stinging his eyes, but his posture stayed firm. He'd grown up in storms like this. The land had taught him to respect danger, not fear it. Thunder rolled overhead. Water roared through the rocks. And in the chaos of it all, something else reached Calder's ears. A sound just barely carried on the wind. A cry. He pulled the rein, slowing his horse. The rain was too loud. Everything sounded like shouting. But then he heard it again, faint and heartbreakingly small, like an animal caught in barbed wire. He held his breath. Help. Calder's heartbeat stumbled. Nobody should have been out in this weather, and no sound that weak could come from anything but a person in terrible trouble. He turned his horse toward the slope leading down to the river. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He simply went. The river was no river anymore. It had become a churning mass of brown water and a flying debris swollen beyond its banks. Rocks vanished beneath the foam. Branches snapped as the current hurled them downstream. And there, wedged between two boulders halfway across, was a boy. A small native child, maybe 7 or 8, clinging to the rock with both hands as the water crashed against him. His face was pale with fear, his dark hair plastered to his skull. His legs dangled in the current, pulled violently with every surge. He looked like he had only moments left before the river swallowed him. Calder's stomach dropped. "Oh God," he whispered. Then he jumped. The icy water punched the breath from his lungs. His boots dragged him down almost instantly, pulling him toward the depths. Calder kicked hard, fighting toward the surface, coughing when he finally broke through. The current took him immediately. He swam against it with everything he had, arms burning chest tight. Rain hammered his face. Another wave hit him sideways and spun him around. For a moment he lost sight of the boy entirely, until a flash of lightning tore across the sky and illuminated the tiny figure clinging to the rock. Calder reached him just as the boy's fingers slipped. "No," he gasped. He lunged forward, grabbed the boy around the torso, and locked his arms tight. The child panicked, thrashing wildly, nearly pulling them both under. "It's okay," Calder shouted over the storm. "I've got you. I've got you." The river slammed into them again, dragging them downstream. Calder kicked hard, angling toward the bank. A wave hit his back, hurling him forward. His shoulders slammed into a submerged boulder. Pain exploded through his arm, but he didn't let go. The boy whimpered, arms, shaking face buried against Calder's soaked shirt. "Hold on," Calder breathed. "Just hold on." Another surge of water crashed into them. Calder used the momentum, forcing himself and the child toward the rocky edge. His fingers scraped stone finally. With all the strength he had left, he shoved the boy upward onto the bank's slippery ledge. The child rolled onto the mud, coughing violently. Calder dragged himself up after him, collapsing beside him. For a moment, neither moved. They lay there gasping rain, hammering their faces alive by the smallest margin. Branches snapped somewhere behind them. Calder lifted his head eyes, barely able to focus. 3 native men burst from the tree line, sprinting toward the boy. One dropped to his knees immediately, checking the child's breathing. Another produced a bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth. The third, a tall man with a carved jawline and long braids, scooped the child into his arms and held him close, murmuring desperately in their language. They all turned sharply toward Calder. They didn't speak, not yet, but the look in their eyes held both shock and a kind of solemn gratitude that words couldn't carry. Calder pushed himself to a sitting position. He opened his mouth to say something, anything but nothing came out. He was too exhausted to speak. One of the men stepped forward, not the father, but an elder. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were bright and sharp. He held a small clay bowl filled with a mixture of red earth and ash. He dipped 2 fingers into the paste. Calder didn't understand. He didn't move. He simply stared as the elder approached, then gently placed those marked fingers on Calder's shoulder. Warmth spread through Calder's skin. The elder drew slow, deliberate strokes, the shape of flowing water and wings meeting in the center. A symbol older than any language Calder knew, a mark not given freely. The elder whispered something in his native tongue, soft, reverent, a blessing, a promise, a recognition. Every warrior present bowed their head. Calder stared at the mark, shocked, breathless. He'd never been part of anything like this. He didn't know the meaning, but he felt the weight of it settle into his bones. He finally managed to speak, voice hoarse. "He's safe now. That's enough." He struggled to his feet, nodded once to the men, climbed onto his drenched horse, and rode away into the storm, back into the rain, the mud, and the solitude of the valley. He never asked the boy's name, never sought thanks. He simply did what he believed was right. Elias finished telling the story slowly, the last words trembling on his lips. Talon stood silent, breathing softly, his dark eyes locked onto Elias. Then Talon pressed his palm flat against his own spirit mark, the one hidden beneath his sleeve. And he said so quietly the wind nearly stole the words, "That boy was me." Elias's breath left him in a single shaken exhale. The old cowboy stared at Talon, seeing him not as the silent, commanding warrior standing before him, but as the frightened child pulled from a deadly river 10 years ago. A debt born of water and blood, a bond forged without words. In that moment, Elias understood a truth larger than himself. His son's act of courage had not vanished into the storm. It had echoed through 10 years. It had been remembered, honored, carried. And now it had returned. Talon stepped closer, placing his hand on Elias's shoulder. "We ride," he said. "Now." Talon lifted 2 fingers to the air in a sharp signal. Nodin and Koan moved instantly, untying their horses. Ashka slung her satchel of herbs over her shoulder. Another warrior checked his bowstring, tightening it with practiced precision. Nobody questioned the decision. Nobody asked for debate. This was a matter of honor. Elias clenched his fists, a mix of hope and terror twisting through him. "I'm coming with you," he said. Talon nodded once. "We will find him, one way or another." The desert night wrapped around them like a cloak as they rode. The moon was a thin blade, hanging over the vast, dark sweep of the Arizona plains, sharp enough to cut the sky, but too narrow to reveal much more than the faint outline of the land beneath. It cast just enough pale light to show them where the earth dipped and rose, where scrub brush clung to the sand, where the trail veered toward the distant ridges. The air was cold in that way. Only desert nights could be the heat of the day, gone without apology. Each gust of wind brought with it the dry scent of red dust and something harsher, metallic, coming from the direction of the canyons far ahead. Behind them, the pinpricks of light from scattered ranch houses shrank into nothing, swallowed one by the curve of the land. Silver Mesa, with its worn bar and quiet streets, faded into memory. Elias Brandt rode with his jaw clenched, fingers locked so tightly around the reins, his knuckles had turned white. His heart pounded, not from the pace of the horses, but from the pounding fear in his chest, fear and hope tangled together so thoroughly that he couldn't separate them anymore. The native warriors rode like shadows. Their horses moved in smooth, unbroken rhythms, hooves barely seeming to disturb the ground. They rode low and balanced, as if they and their mounts were a single creature slipping through the night. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every small motion, every shift of weight, said what words could not. Talon led the group, his silhouette straight and unwavering, in the dim light eyes, fixed on a horizon only he seemed to see. After what felt like an eternity and only minutes at the same time, Talon raised his hand. The riders slowed to a halt. Cohen Greyhawk swung down from his saddle without a word, landing on one knee in the dirt. He pressed his palm to the ground, fingers spreading out lightly over the faint crush marks left in the dried earth. He studied the flattened grass, the way a few stalks bent in the same direction. He shifted his gaze to the darker trough carved into the soil, a tire track, still soft edges, not yet crumbled. He ran his fingertips along it, then brought the dust to his nose, sniffing, measuring how long it had been since the tire had rolled through. He looked toward the breeze, watching how it moved the grass tops, feeling how dry the air was. "They went southeast," he murmured. "More than 2 men. Not long ago." Nodin, standing beside him, scanned the horizon with narrowed eyes and then gave a small, confirming nod. Talon didn't hesitate. He turned his horse in that direction and jerked his chin for the others to follow. They rode on. The land slowly transformed as they went. The open grass thinned, giving way to bare stretches of packed earth. Red stones began to break through the ground, small at first, then larger, then rising into jagged outcrops. Soon walls of rock began to flank the trail in rough, uneven lines, climbing higher and higher until they loomed above like the ribs of some giant buried beast. The air funneled between them, growing colder, tighter. The sound of the wind changed too, no longer free roaming, but trapped, echoing, whispering among the stones. Red Basin Gorge. If they wanted to hide a man, Talon said quietly, eyeing the narrowing path ahead, this would be the place. Elias swallowed hard. He knew this area. He'd warned Calder about it before: steep drops, sudden ledges, places a horse could break its legs and a man could vanish. And now his son might be somewhere inside its teeth. The moonlight struck the rock faces in sharp angles, throwing long, reaching shadows across the ground, like arms stretching out of the canyon, ready to pull anyone foolish enough close. Talon lifted his hand again this time, lower signaling for them to slow. Far ahead, a tiny flicker appeared, a smear of orange against the darkness. Firelight. Cohen raised 2 fingers, motioning for them to stop completely. They dismounted in silence, tying the horses to a stunted tree growing stubbornly out of the rock. The animals snorted softly, sensing the tension, but stayed quiet under their riders' calming hands. The group moved forward on foot. They hugged the rocks, each step carefully placed, each breath measured. Cohen and Nodin took the lead, Talon close behind. Ashka walked a little behind them, one hand resting on the satchel at her hip. Elias followed, trying to match their silent steps, fighting the urge to rush ahead. The sound of crackling fire drifted toward them from somewhere just beyond a rise in the ground. Shadows moved just out of sight, long warped shapes stretching from a small campfire, and a canvas structure pitched against the canyon wall. They were close. Then in the quiet, Nodin's boot nudged a loose stone. The rock tumbled down the slope. One bounce, another. Cack, cack, cack. Inside the camp, a chair scraped loudly. Heavy footsteps hit the ground. A figure burst from the tent, Mac Dover's, thick-necked and jittery, a gun already in his hand. He didn't wait to see what was there. He panicked. He fired into the dark. The gunshots exploded across the gorge, 3 sharp echoing booms that ricocheted between the stone walls, sparks flying where stray bullets smacked rock. Elias flinched, dropping down instinctively. Cohen didn't. In one fluid motion, he raised his bow, not aiming for Mac, but for the one thing that made the camp visible at all. The arrow screamed through the night. It punched clean through the hanging lantern above the fire. Glass shattered. Oil spilled. The flame sputtered, flared, then died. Darkness slammed over the camp like a door. Mac cursed loudly. Where the hell are they? Somewhere behind him there was a crash. Frank Lytle stumbling into a crate he hadn't seen now that the light was gone. "Watch where you're going, you idiot." He snarled into the dark. But he wasn't yelling at Mac anymore. He was yelling at fear. In the suffocating black, Talon moved. He slipped from cover like a shadow, peeling away from the rock, closing the distance between himself and Mac in seconds. Before Mac could turn the gun in any useful direction, Talon's arm clamped around his wrist. He twisted, and the weapon jerked downward, fired into the dirt. A heartbeat later, Mac was on his back, and the air crushed from his lungs as Talon's knee pinned his chest. Nodin was a blur on the opposite side. He lunged for Frank's arm just as Frank tried to raise his own gun. Bone met stone with a sickening crack when Nodin slammed his wrist against a rock. The pistol flew from Frank's hand and skidded across the ground. The camp collapsed into chaos, shouts, heavy breathing, the scrape of boots on rock. Elias didn't wait. He bolted for the tent. Canvas brushed his shoulders as he ducked inside, heart hammering louder than the gunshots still echoing in his ears. And there, tied to a post in the center of the tent, was Calder. His son's head hung forward. His wrists were lashed behind the post with thick rope. His bottom lip was split, swollen, a line of dried blood running from the corner down his chin. There was a bruise blossoming dark along his jaw. For one terrible moment, Elias thought he was too late. Calder, Elias whispered, stumbling forward. He dropped to his knees and fumbled for the knife at his belt, hands shaking so badly he nearly missed the rope. At the first saw of the blade, the fibers began to fray. Calder stirred. "Pa!" His voice was little more than a ragged breath. Elias nearly choked with relief. "Yeah, boy. I'm here. I've got you." The ropes snapped. Calder pitched forward, and Elias caught him pulling his son against his chest, holding on like he'd never let go again. Outside, the scuffle was already ending. Frank realized all in one terrifying instant that the shadows weren't just shadows. There were men in them, men who moved faster than he did, who knew the land better than he ever would, who had come for someone he'd thought was alone. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He ran. He spun on his heel and sprinted up the rocky incline, scrambling toward one of the narrow exits of the gorge. His boots slipped on loose gravel. Panic carved his breathing into sharp, ragged gasps. "Mac," he yelled. "Move, move." Mac didn't answer. He was too busy hitting the ground. Noden caught him by the collar at the top of the slope. Mac's weight meant nothing to the warrior. He yanked the man backward as if he were a sack of grain, then slammed him flat onto the dirt. Mac groaned, dazed, the fight knocked clean out of him. The gunfire had stopped. The shouting had stopped. The world seemed to exhale. The only sounds left were the rough, uneven breaths of Calder Brent inside the tent, the softer, shuddering breaths of his father, and the low, constant whisper of wind curling between the red canyon walls. Ash from the shattered lantern floated upward in faint gray wisps, rising into the dark like remnants of a nightmare dissolving into the sky. Talon stepped into the tent flap, letting his eyes adjust to what little light came from the moon outside. He saw Elias on his knees, arm around Calder, holding him as if afraid the boy might vanish if he loosened his grip. Slowly, Talon knelt beside them. He reached out and laid his hand gently on Calder's shoulder, right over the spirit mark beneath his torn shirt. For a moment he didn't speak, his eyes closed briefly as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he opened them, and his voice came low, steady, and full of the kind of weight that made men listen. "You saved me when we were boys," he said. "Tonight I return what was given." Calder's eyelids fluttered. He looked up confused at first, then slowly recognizing the cadence of that voice, the shape of that face, older now, harder, but still carrying something familiar from a rainy night long ago. Elias watched them both, his throat tight. He knew without needing explanation what those words meant. Ashka pushed into the tent next, dropping to a crouch beside Calder. She set her satchel down and began to work with calm efficiency. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to Calder's neck, feeling his pulse, then checked his pupils, lifting one eyelid and then the other. She listened to his breathing, her brow furrowing at the shallow, pained rhythm. She reached into her bag and pulled out a bundle of crushed leaves wrapped in cloth. She broke it open the air, filling with the sharp herbal scent of wild plants dried under the sun. She mixed the herbs with water in a small bowl, making a paste and spreading it gently along the worst of the bruises, the cuts along his ribs. Steam rose faintly from the mixture, carrying warmth into skin that had gone too cold. Then she took a strip of clean cloth and wrapped it firmly around his chest, binding his ribs. Calder hissed softly at the pressure, but Ashka only nodded. "He'll make it," she said. "But he needs rest and warmth." Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He squeezed his son's hand tight, as if grounding himself with a touch. Together, Noden and Cohen lifted Calder carefully and carried him from the tent. Outside, the air was even colder, but the sky had begun to pale at the edges, a hint of dawn touching the far horizon. They laid Calder across the broad back of the steadiest horse in the group. Elias took hold of the reins and stood beside his son, refusing to leave his side for even a second. Talon mounted his own horse and glanced toward the mouth of the gorge. The first faint threads of light were starting to creep down the rock faces, turning the upper edges of the canyon from dark maroon to a deep, glowing orange. "We ride back," he said. "Now." The small procession moved out of Red Basin Gorge, the canyon slowly spitting them back into the open land. The farther they rode, the more the world brightened. The eastern sky shifted from indigo to violet, then to a gentle wash of pink and gold. Sunlight slid over the red rock walls behind them, setting them ablaze in a way that made them look less like stone and more like the glowing embers of a huge, ancient fire. Elias glanced back once and felt something loosen inside his chest. The place that had nearly taken his son's life was now behind them, shrinking into the distance. The native warriors formed a loose arc around Calder, their horses moving in a protective pattern, unconsciously shielding him from every side. The wind grew softer as the sun climbed the cold, giving way to the first warmth of morning. By the time they reached the outskirts of Silver Mesa, the town was beginning to wake. A shopkeeper was rolling up the front of his stall. A woman swept dust from her porch. A boy chased a dog down the street laughing until he saw the riders and stopped, his smile falling away into silent awe. People turned. They stared. The sight was not one Silver Mesa was used to native warriors riding in formation, leading their horses in a slow, deliberate line through the edge of town. At the center of that formation, a battered but breathing young cowboy resting across a saddle, and his father walking beside him, one hand gripping the reins, the other resting protectively on his son's arm. Whispers spread faster than the hooves moved. Is that Elias Brandt's boy? Those are Yazzies, aren't they? Since when do they ride together? Some people instinctively stepped back, watching from doorways and windows. Others shaded their eyes with their hands, trying to take it in from a distance. No one spoke to the riders. No one dared to step into their path. They watched a story they didn't yet understand pass right in front of them. Back at the Brandt Ranch, the house looked small against the brightening sky. Weathered boards, a creaking porch, a gate that had seen better years. But to Elias, it was the center of the world. He helped Calder down from the horse, supporting his son's weight with an arm around his shoulders. Calder's legs almost buckled, but he managed to make it up the porch steps, one slow step at a time. Elias eased him down onto the top step, letting him sit and catch his breath. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Elias sank down beside him, his voice low and rough. "Son, I didn't understand what you did back then," he said. "I didn't know who you'd saved. I didn't know what it meant. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I didn't see the weight of it sooner." Calder's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles. His eyes were half closed, but there was a peace there that hadn't been there before. "I didn't save him for praise," he murmured. "I just couldn't walk away." The words cut Elias in two and stitched him back together in the same heartbeat. Pride and regret twisted inside him, leaving his eyes wet, his chest aching. Behind them, Talon stood a few paces back, listening. At Calder's words, he nodded once firmly, as if confirming an unspoken truth. He stepped forward and loosened the leather cord around his neck. From it, he took a small stone black shot through with veins of deep green, smoothed by years of handling. Etched into its surface were the same flowing lines of water and wing that formed the spirit mark on his skin. Talon knelt in front of Calder and placed the stone in his hand. "This mark chose you," he said quietly. "This land knows you." He paused, let that sink in, then added, "Family isn't blood. It's who stands beside you when danger comes." Calder curled his fingers around the stone, feeling its cool weight press into his palm. It felt like more than a token. It felt like a promise hammered into form. The other warriors began to mount up one by one, saddles creaking softly. Hooves shifted on the packed dirt of the yard. The horses snorted, eager to move. Talon rose, stepped back, and swung into his saddle. Before he turned away, he looked Elias straight in the eye. "Your son stands with honor," he said, "and so do you." Then he turned his horse and nudged it forward. The others followed a seamless motion that spoke of long practice. Together, they rode away from the Brant Ranch hooves, drumming lightly against the red-brown earth, kicking up soft clouds of dust that drifted into the morning air. The sound of their departure faded slowly, like a drumbeat growing distant. Soon, only the echo remained. Elias stood beside his son on the porch, watching until the last rider disappeared beyond the low hills. Calder leaned against the wooden railing, breathing shallow but steady eyes fixed on the horizon. Neither said anything for a while. They didn't need to. They both knew that the world they'd woken up to the day before was not the same one they were standing in now. Lines that had been taught to them as unbreakable between cowboy and native, between us and them, between fear and trust, had blurred under the weight of what had happened in one long, brutal night. The sun climbed higher. Warmth slid across Calder's shoulder. The spirit mark there, drawn by an elder's hand 10 years earlier, glowed faintly in the light, its curves of water and wing clearer than they had been in years, as if the land itself were reminding them what it meant. Elias glanced at it, his expression softening. That thing he said quietly, it really did mean something after all. Calder reached up with careful fingers and brushed the mark, a tired smile tugging at his mouth. Guess it finally meant something, huh? Elias swallowed past the tightness in his throat, nodded, and couldn't find any words strong enough to answer. So he did the only thing left that mattered. He stayed, right there beside his son, on their land. In the days that followed, the ranch grew quiet in a way that didn't feel like peace. Calder healed slowly. The bruises along his ribs shifted from deep purple to yellow. The sharp pain in his side eased into a constant nagging ache. He moved carefully, half out of stubbornness, half to keep Elias from hovering too much. He did small chores, refilling water troughs, checking the barn, coiling ropes, but every sudden twist of his torso reminded him just how close things had come to ending in that canyon. Elias went back to the fences. He patched broken posts, straightened wire where the struggle had bent it, rehung a gate that had been knocked crooked. It was work he'd done his whole life, the kind of work that usually settled his mind. But now, even as his hands moved on their own, his thoughts didn't quiet. Every hammer strike echoed the same question. For how long, out in town, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Did you hear natives rode out to Brant's place at dawn? Someone muttered over coffee. They say they escorted him home, another added, like he was one of theirs. Calder's mixed up with that tribe somehow. Markings, promises, who knows what else. The glances changed first. Where there had once been nods, casual waves, and small talk about weather, now there were narrowed eyes and quick looks away. Conversation stopped when Elias walked into the feed store. People spoke to him, but too carefully, as if he was standing on thin ice and might drag them down if they got too close. At the diner, Calder felt it like weight on his back. A woman who'd known him since he was a boy gave him a stiff smile and turned her shoulders slightly, as if to shield her children. A rancher at the next table spoke loudly about outsiders meddling where they don't belong, never looking directly at Calder, but not needing to. He tried to shrug it off, but it stuck. One morning, a truck rattled up the ranch drive, dust rolling off its tires. It wasn't Frank Lydell. It was a man in a shirt too clean for ranch work, carrying a leather briefcase and a stack of envelopes. "Elias Brant?" he asked. Elias wiped his hands on his jeans. "That's me." The man handed him a thick, official-looking envelope. "You've been served? Notices of dispute. I'd suggest you read them with someone who understands this sort of thing." He left before Elias could ask anything else. At the kitchen table, father and son sat shoulder to shoulder, staring at the papers. Legal words crawled across the pages: boundary encroachment, disputed acreage. Temporary injunction, cease and desist from using the contested land. There were maps with red lines drawn in ways Elias had never seen before. Lines that shaved chunks off the far pasture, the creek, the section where his cattle graze every spring. "It's our land," Elias said, voice tight. "My father worked it. His father before him. They're saying you've been over the line," Calder murmured. "For years. That what you think is yours is negotiable." Elias let the papers fall. "Last time it was guns and fists," he muttered. "Now it's ink and stamps, same men, different weapons." News of the dispute moved quickly. By the end of the week, the town had called a meeting at the community hall. People filled the creaking chairs, packed shoulder to shoulder, ranchers, shopkeepers, old-timers, and younger families hoping to carve a future out of the dust. Frank Liddell stood near the front, hair slicked back, a neat jacket on, playing the part of respectable investor. He smiled too easily, laughed at the right moments, shook the right hands. "We have to think bigger," Frank told the room. "Development brings jobs, roads, money. Imagine what this town could be." Some nodded. They'd struggled for years. The idea of bigger tugged at something raw and hungry inside them. Others frowned, arms crossed. Someone muttered about the native presence, about lines getting blurry, about who really owns what. Elias stood up to speak. "We're not talking about imaginary lines," he said. "We're talking about land that feeds cattle, about the creek that keeps the grass alive. My family has lived." "We're not here to debate history," Elias Frank cut in smoothly. "We're here to talk about the future and the law." A few people shifted uncomfortably. The moderator hesitated, then gave an apologetic shrug. Calder watched all of it from a seat near the back. The words slid around him like water around a rock. He saw the divide in every turned shoulder, every whispered exchange. He realized with a sinking clarity that what was true didn't matter if no one was willing to hear it. When they left the hall, the sky had gone slate gray, hanging heavy over Silver Mesa. On the ride home, Calder kept his eyes on the road. "Maybe I made everything worse," he said quietly. If I hadn't gotten involved that night by the river, if I hadn't carried this mark, maybe none of this would be happening to you." Elias pulled his horse to a stop. Calder did too. "That's what you're thinking?" Elias asked, turning to him. "That saving a child's life is what brought this trouble to our door?" Calder didn't answer right away. "It feels like everything traces back to that night," he admitted. "To that mark. To me. You're the one they're going after. Your land. Your name. That's on me." Elias stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "I don't fear losing land," he said. "Land shifts. Borders change. You can fence it, brand it, fight over it. But it was here long before you and me, and it'll be here long after we're gone." His voice roughened. "I fear losing you." Calder swallowed hard. "The mark," he said, looking down at his shoulder, feeling its presence even through the fabric. "I thought it was just something from the past. A reminder. A story I'd tell my kids someday. Now it feels like something else. Like it's dragging us into a fight we didn't ask for." Or Elias said quietly, "It's telling you the fight was always there. We just hadn't seen it yet." Days later, Tal and Yazzie rode into town alone. No formation of warriors, no dramatic entrance. Just one man on a dusty horse wearing jeans and a simple jacket, his hair braided and tied back, his presence quieter than the last time Silver Mesa had seen him. People noticed, of course. They watched from behind windows, peeked around door frames. No one approached. Talon dismounted outside the hardware store where Calder was picking up nails and fence staples. Calder saw him through the window and felt his pulse kick. They met in the street. "You didn't bring anyone," Calder said. "I didn't need anyone," Talon replied. "This time I'm not here to fight." He nodded toward the legal envelope sticking out of Calder's back pocket. "They switched weapons," Talon said. "Men like Lydell aren't afraid of fists or guns. They expect those. They're afraid of something else, like what Calder asked. Legitimacy," Talon said. "Being seen for what they are. Losing control of the story." He looked Calder over, eyes lingering briefly on his shoulder where the spirit mark lay beneath the fabric. "You think your mark is about the past," Talon said. "It isn't. It's about where you stand when the ground starts to move." "How am I supposed to stand against this?" Calder asked. "I'm one cowboy with a half-broken rib." "You're not alone," Talon said simply. "You weren't alone in that canyon. You're not alone now. Next time they come for you on paper or in person, we're not letting you stand by yourself." There was no thunderclap behind his words, no ceremonial marker. Just a quiet promise laid down like a stone. And promises like that had weight. Weeks later, Calder rode in a different direction. The land shifted beneath his horse's hooves as he crossed from the ranch into territory that felt older somehow, even though the grass and rocks looked almost the same. Elias rode with him for the first stretch, then slowed near a small rise where the boundary between their lands and the tribal territory became more suggestion than line. "You don't have to go," Elias said. "I do," Calder answered. "If this mark ties me to them, I need to know what that really means." Elias wanted to say no. He wanted to bring his son home and bolt the door. Instead, he nodded and watched as Calder rode on Talon, waiting for him at a distance, ready to guide him deeper into the land his people called sacred. The farther they went, the quieter it became. Not silent, never truly silent. There was always the sound of wind through grass, of birds calling from rocky outcrops of distant water, moving somewhere out of sight. But it was a different kind of quiet than the ranch, a quiet that felt deliberate. The camp was simple. Low-weathered buildings, a large fire pit, stones blackened from years of use. Children's laughter carried on the air from somewhere behind a low ridge. There was no sign, no fence marking the place as important, and yet Calder felt its weight as soon as he dismounted. A man of deep age and deeper eyes waited for them near the central fire. His hair was white and braided his face, mapped with lines that looked like the same creases etched into the land itself. He wore no elaborate headdress, no ostentatious jewelry. Just a cloak, beads at his wrist, and a gaze that made Calder feel simultaneously small and seen. "This is Elder Roan," Talon said. "He's the one who oversaw the marking on your shoulder." Calder's breath caught. "So I was there," Rowan said. His voice was like dry leaves rubbing together. "I watched you walk away into the storm without asking for so much as a thank you." Not many would do that. Calder shifted, unsure what to say. Roan gestured to the log near the fire. "Sit." They did. The elder looked at the flames for a long moment before speaking. "You think the spirit mark is a prize," he said. "A gift for something good you did." "It is not." Calder frowned slightly. "Then what is it? A calling?" Roan answered. "It does not reward you. It requires you." He lifted a stick, nudging the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. People who carry that mark, Roan said, find themselves at the crossing of things, where old ways and new ways clash, where greed and survival push against each other. You will be put there again and again. Not because you sought it out, because you were chosen to stand there. Calder felt the words settle in his chest like stones. so it doesn't protect me," he said quietly. Roan shook his head. "No, it will not spare you pain. It will give you responsibility." Talon watched Calder carefully, as if taking measure of how those words landed. "It doesn't seem very fair," Calder said, attempting a half-smile. Roan's lips twitched. Fair is a word people use when they forget they're part of something bigger than themselves. Later, Talon took Calder to the edges of their territory. They stood on a rocky rise, overlooking a thin, tired ribbon of water that had once been a strong stream. Its banks were pulled inward, grass around it brittle. Not far beyond, bright flags fluttered, marking survey points. Trucks had left deep ruts in the soil. Strange metal equipment glinted under tarps. "Mining company," Talon said. "They say there's money in the rock. They don't talk much about what happens when the water goes bad." In the distance, a few kids kicked a ball in the dirt, glancing over at the flags with something like unease in their eyes. "Some of our young ones are already leaving," Talon said. "Farther east, cities, jobs. You can't blame them. But when water dries, when the ground is poisoned, what do they come back to? What is left to fight for?" Calder stared at the flagged grids, at the worn-down stream, at the children who would inherit whatever came next. "So if they take our ranch," Calder said slowly, "they'd have a straight line to this." "It's all connected," Talon said. "Your land, ours, the creek that runs between. Men like Liddell don't see boundaries the way we do. They see opportunity." That night, Elias came to the camp as well. He sat across from Rowan by the fire, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. The stars spilled across the sky above them, countless and bright. "I raised my boy to do what's right," Elias said, staring into the flames. "To help where he could. To stand up when he saw someone in trouble. I thought that was enough." He shook his head. "I never taught him what to do when the world doesn't reward that. When it punishes it instead. I never taught him how to live in a place that pays men like Liddell to tear things apart." Roan watched him for a time, then nodded. "You taught him the first part," the elder said. "The land taught him the rest." Elias looked up. He listened. Rowan went on. "When the river cried out that night, he heard it. When the boy was drowning, he moved. When the mark was given, he didn't stay to demand what it meant. He accepted the cost before he knew the price." He tilted his head toward the dark edge of the plain. "Most men close their ears when the land speaks. Your son did not. That is not a failure on your part, Elias Brandt. It is what makes him dangerous to men who live only for themselves." Later still, Talon and Calder sat alone at the edge of camp, looking out over the dim shapes of hills. "You know," Talon said quietly that night by the river, "for years I thought about it only one way. You saved me. I owed you. Simple." "That's how I thought of it too," Calder admitted. Talon shook his head. "Not anymore," he said. "I didn't come back just because I owed a debt. I came back because that night, that was the first time I realized I could be more than the one who needs saving." He looked out into the darkness. "The mark on me is the same as yours," he said. "It doesn't point in one direction. It's a circle. It means that someday I'd step into the water for someone else. Not because I had to, because I chose to." He glanced at Calder. "You gave me that choice," he said. "I wasn't leaving you in that canyon." The quiet between them then wasn't empty. It was full. Frank Liddell returned the way men like him always did. Not with an ambush in the dark this time. Not with a rifle or paid fists. But in the broad light of late afternoon, in a polished truck that shone like a coin, driving straight up the Brandt Ranch road as if he owned it already. Elias watched from the porch. Calder stepped out from the barn, resting a hand unconsciously on his ribs. Frank climbed out, wearing that same easy smile. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he called. "Got ourselves some business to settle, I think." He held a folder in one hand, thick-tabbed full of paper. In the other was something smaller, a single envelope. "I'm not here to fight," Frank said, stopping a few yards from the porch. "In fact, I'm here to offer a solution." Calder's jaw tightened. "We've seen your solutions." "Not like this," Frank said. "This is generous. You'll want to hear it." He laid it out in that smooth, practiced tone. A buyout more money than the ranch had made in a decade of hard seasons. A promise of legal shielding from any fallout should anyone come asking questions. Help relocating if they wanted it. A guarantee that no one would accidentally end up in a canyon again. "All you have to do," Frank said, "is sell. Sign over the land and cut ties with those people." He jerked his head vaguely toward the horizon. Simple, clean. Everybody walks away happy. Elias didn't hesitate. "No," he said. Frank's smile thinned. "Think about your age, Elias. About medical bills. About what happens if the next accident doesn't end so well." "I said no," Elias repeated. Calder raised a hand slightly. "Wait." Elias turned surprise and hurt flickering across his face. "Son, I'm not agreeing," Calder said. I need to think." Frank pounced on the hesitation. "Good," he said. "Sleeping on things is smart. I'll give you a few days. But opportunities like this don't last forever." When Frank's truck finally rolled away, dust curling up behind it, Elias rounded on his son. "You're not actually considering that," he said, voice low. Calder dragged a hand through his hair, eyes troubled. "If we fight him, he keeps coming. If we take the deal, at least you're safe." Safe, where Elias demanded. A motel off some highway, a rented house in a place that never knew your name. This land, this life, is who you are. And if staying here gets you killed, Calder shot back. What then? It was the first time in a long time that fear made them stand on opposite sides of something. That night, Calder lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of every possible choice pressing down on him. He could take the money, drag his father out of harm's way, and live with the taste of betrayal in his mouth. Or he could stay fight a man who owned more lawyers than cattle and watch the town rip itself apart around them. It felt like a trap with only two doors, and both of them led somewhere bad. But the land had taught him something long before his father ever had. When a river meets stone, it doesn't stop. It finds a third way, a new path. By morning, Calder had an idea, not a simple one, not an easy one, but a different kind of weapon. They reached out to Talon, Tyrone, to a woman in the city who worked with tribal councils and federal land protections. They spread maps across the Brant kitchen table, scratched lines and notes until the paper looked like a battlefield of ink. When Frank returned for his answer, he didn't find a man ready to sign his land away. He found a proposal. "You want to buy this ranch?" Calder said, standing in the yard with Talon beside him and Elias on his other side. "You can't. Not the way you planned. We've filed a petition." Frank's brows lifted. "A petition to designate a portion of our land," Calder said, "and the connecting sections toward the tribal territory as a jointly managed conservation area." Frank stared. "Protected," Calder continued. "Federally recognized. Co-managed by us and Talon's people. Which means you don't get to strip it, drill it, or carve it up. You can't buy it out from under us. And if you try to touch it, you won't just be fighting an old cowboy and a handful of warriors. You'll be fighting every law you thought you could twist." Frank laughed once sharply. "You think one piece of paper is going to stop men like me?" "No," Calder said. I think a town that finally sees what you are will. The announcement came days later in the same community hall where Frank had once spoken so smoothly about progress. This time, he stood off to the side. At the front stood Calder hair, still shaggy from weeks of distraction, ribs still stiff but eyes clear. Beside him, Talon and Elder Roan. Behind them, large maps pinned to boards showing the river, the ranch, the tribal lands, and the redrawn shape of the proposed protected area. Calder told the story he'd never intended to tell anyone. About the storm 10 years ago. About the boy in the river. About waking up with a mark on his shoulder he didn't understand. About the canyon. About being nearly beaten to death over a piece of dirt that didn't just belong to him. He talked about the water. How what flowed through the Brant land didn't stop at any fence line. How it moved under and across feeding grass on ranches and roots on tribal land alike. How if someone poisoned or drained it for short-term gain, it wouldn't just hurt them or us, it would hurt everybody. The land isn't just something you own, he said. It's something that lets you exist. You can buy and sell papers all you want, but you can't rewrite what water does. Some people shifted uncomfortably. A few rolled their eyes. But others listened, really listened. Talon spoke too. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply described what he'd seen: the survey flags, the shrinking stream, the children thinking about leaving the only home their families had known for generations, because it seemed like the land itself was giving up. Rowan spoke last, his voice thin, but carrying. Our lives are not separate, he said. The river does not check passports. The sky does not ask which side of a fence you sleep on. You can pretend you stand alone. Or you can admit the truth that what happens to one of us will one day happen to all. Some people left the hall before he finished. They didn't want to hear it. They needed the world to stay simpler than that. But some stayed. Some nodded. Some, for the first time, looked over at Frank Liddell and didn't see a man offering opportunity. They saw a man who stood to gain everything if the land lost. In the weeks that followed, pressure pushed from both sides. Lawyers' calls, threats, promises. But a strange thing happened. The more Frank tried to regain control of the story, the less people believed him. A boundary surveyor came forward with questions about altered maps. A clerk at the courthouse mentioned odd timing on some filings. Someone from out of town, the woman Calder had called, arrived with folders full of case precedents and sat down with the town council. Slowly, the ground shifted. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic takedowns. One day, Frank's truck sat in front of his rented house. The next, it was gone. His company's name disappeared from the mining documents. Another firm stepped in, this one smaller, more cautious eyes on the new protected zone and its legal teeth. Frank didn't lose because someone punched harder. He lost because there was nowhere left to hide what he was. And he knew it. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale afterward. Bills still had to be paid. Fences still broke. The legal process of establishing the conservation area moved like molasses, slow and full of tedious meetings and too many signatures. Some neighbors stopped coming by altogether. Others came more often, bringing questions and sometimes quiet apologies. But the river kept flowing. Months later, children played on its banks, some native, some the sons and daughters of cowboys, clothes, dusty, laughter loud. They skipped stones, dared each other to wade, ankle deep, shrieked when the water was colder than they expected. On the porch of the Brant house, Elias sat in his usual chair, a blanket over his knees, hat tilted down just enough to shade his eyes from the afternoon sun. He looked older than he had a year before. But he looked settled somehow, like something in him had finally unclenched. Calder stood near the fence, one boot propped on the lowest rail. His hand drifted to his shoulder fingers, resting lightly over the spirit mark beneath his shirt. It no longer felt like a mystery branding him with a past he barely understood. It felt like a reminder of storms, weathered of choices made of a line in the sand he had chosen to stand on. Guess it finally meant something, huh? He murmured to himself, a wry smile touching his lips. Down by the river, Talon watched the kids play, arms folded loosely over his chest. He glanced up toward the house, caught Calder's eye, and lifted his hand in a small, simple salute. Calder returned it. The land stretched between them, red and brown, and gold, stubborn and vulnerable, ancient and newly protected. It wasn't safe. Not really. It might never be. There would be other storms, other men like Frank, other fights over water and rock and the right to stay. But for now, the ground under their feet felt sure. And somewhere deep in that ground, deeper than survey stakes could reach, the land itself remembered who had stood to protect it. The ones who carried marks they hadn't asked for. The ones who stopped when everyone else kept riding. The ones who understood that sometimes family isn't who shares your blood, it's who stands beside you when the world starts to move. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this story. Your time, your attention, and your support truly mean everything to this channel. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey we tell together.